I'm Kat.
And I'm Katie. And you're tuned in to the Kat and Katie Show.
Powered by aXcelerate.
That we jump into your settings and into your system settings. And this is where we start to set up all of the important information directly related to your finance. So during your implementation, the system settings is the very first thing that we look at. And at that very first hour of your training, you don't know what you don't know. So we don't really jump much into finance details, but we do indicate that in your additional options is where you have a lot of the finance set up. So what we're going to be looking at today is everything from our accounting software and all of this information here. So as most of you are aware, that aXcelerate has a lot of integrations where we can integrate and export your finance details to accounting software systems such as Xero and MyOp. We can also integrate with QuickBooks, and we can download a CSV file. So this is where we select what accounting software we're using, so that CSV file that you're downloading is relevant to the accounting software you're using, and mostly relevant to the version you're using as well. We do have an invoice number prefix, padding, and seed. So this area here is relating to what your invoice number would look like. So our prefix is indicating any characters that come before the invoice number. We usually recommend to use AX here at aXcelerate. And the reason why we recommend using AX is because if you do have any type of integration, such as you're integrating to MyOp, for example, then the invoice number prefix of AX indicates that all the invoices in MyOp that have AX and then your number after it have been exported from aXcelerate. It also ensures that you don't have any duplicates. For example, you might still be using MyOp to raise invoices for anything that's not related to your training, so any other business invoices that you're raising. And they might have a invoice prefix of MYOB, for example. And so having a prefix here of AX ensures that there's no duplicates when you're exporting. Our padding is how many digits you have after the prefix. For most accounting softwares, you do have unlimited invoice numbers, but I'm aware that with MyOp, you are only allowed a maximum of 8 characters, which includes your prefix. So for this example, if I was exporting to MyOp, I have to ensure that my prefix is 2 digits if my padding is going to be 6, so my invoice number does not exceed an 8-character limit. We do have, I guess, fail-safes in the system that if you have MyOp integration turned on and you're trying to create a prefix and a padding that exceeds the 8 seeds or the 8 digits, that you're not going to be able to do it. But just to remember that if I am setting up for MyOp, I'm going to have my padding for 6, and AX would equal the 2, I guess those two together will be my maximum of 8 characters. We can see with my invoice seed here that it's already locked. And when you enter your invoice seed in, it would remind you or come up with a little blue alert saying that once you set your invoice number seed, it will be locked and you cannot change it, which is why we always recommend, if you are going to be practicing and testing finance before implementing, to do it in your staging environment. Because while it's still locked in your staging environment, if nothing's set in your live, when our refresh occurs, that would all be wiped and you can start again. What this invoice number seed is saying is what is the first invoice number you would like to start from. So for here, with my settings, my first invoice number will be AX, and then there'll be 6 digits. And there will be 4 zeros and then the 53. So my invoice number will be AX 000053. A lot of people might start with their invoice number at 1,000, so that the first person that's invoiced from aXcelerate isn't getting an invoice number with the invoice number of 1. They might get the invoice number of 1,000. And what we've just discussed then for invoice number prefix, padding, and seed is exactly the same for credit note prefix, padding, and seed.
I might just jump in very quickly and just mention one other thing. During implementation, we do have clients that will already, they'll already have a seed number that they'll be using in their finance system. So, over in their MyOp system or over in Xero, they might already be up to 2,322, as their first initial invoice number. Now, with some of our clients, they'll actually choose to, their seed number in aXcelerate might be set to the very next number within that sequence. It's totally fine to do that as well, but we do tend to find that given that it is a brand new sort of integration that you might be starting, and I guess to just alleviate the risk that you might end up with a duplication of those numbers, we do recommend starting, I guess, a new number sequence, or at least popping a prefix in there like AX, or possibly the initials of your organization or something like that, just so that you know that it is from aXcelerate, as Kat said. So yeah, that's kind of a different way that some of our clients will handle it, but we do tend to suggest starting from fresh can be helpful as well, in terms of just knowing where that invoice came from.
Okay, so continuing on with our finance settings. When you create an invoice in aXcelerate, it automatically has the due date set, and you can set how many days in the future that invoice due date is. You might say that as soon as I raise it from today, it's due today, and you can actually put 0 in there so that the due date is the date that it was raised. By default, when you first come into aXcelerate, it's always set to 7 days, but you can override that, and that's for every single invoice in your entire system. We then have an overwrite invoice date when finalizing, and what this means is that you might have an invoice that has an invoice number, but you're still adding items to it, and you haven't locked and you haven't finalized the invoice. So you're still adding line items to it. You haven't issued it to anyone. It's an existing invoice in your system, but it's just not finalized yet. And what this does here, if I was to change this to yes, is that as soon as I finalize that invoice, my invoice creation date would update to today. So for example, I might have raised my invoice 3 weeks ago, and in the past 3 weeks, I've been adding line items to it, maybe removing line items from it, but I haven't finalized it. The second I finalize it, let's say it was today that I finalized it, my invoice creation date will update to the 24th of October. We will look at creating finance codes shortly and have a look at some default finance codes we can set. But this here is saying if I am going to raise postage against each of my invoice and put a postage cost there, what would I like my postage finance code to be? So I can look for if I've already got one existing, which I do, and I can set that my postage code will be 63200. We've discussed credit note. Well, we discussed prefix pattern and seed, and this is just for our credit notes, exactly the same as what's for our invoice.
So you might, for say, a credit note prefix, put CR for credit or CN for credit note, just so that you can distinguish the two very easily.
Okay, so let me go ahead and save my additional settings. So whenever we start to talk about, especially in when we're doing training and we're onboarding clients, is the first thing we look at when we discuss finance is your system settings. You will not be able to raise an invoice if you do not have any invoicing rules set. So you may have found that you've gone to go and raise someone's invoice, and you get a warning up saying no invoice rule has been set, and this or these here are what the invoice rules are. So this is the very first point. You can do this in your staging as well. So if you're testing and playing with the finance in your staging, go into your settings, into your additional options, create some invoice number, prefix, pattern, and seed, and then test your finance system. The great way of doing it, or the great reason for doing it in your staging environment, is that even though this says locked in your staging environment, it's not locked in your live. Furthermore, when you create invoices in your staging account, they're all fictitious invoices, and they will eventually be overridden, but they don't create an audit trail. If you were to raise invoices in your live account, they do create an audit trail, and they cannot be removed from your live account, unless you create a credit note, of course. But we will be looking at invoicing and managing your finances in a later webinar. So what we'd like to look at now is we're continuing to looking into finance setup. And our finance setup is managing a few of these areas underneath here. We do have some tabs that you might do when you're setting up your finances, such as payment plans and discounts, but because they're quite a large area, we've dedicated a whole nother webinar to those two. So what we will be looking at today are these 3 items here. So creating finance codes, creating item lists, and then creating finance models. And when we go into each one, we'll also discuss what they are. So the first one we start off with always is finance codes. You can see here that we've got a large list of finance codes. Now, for some people that do have integrations, especially with cloud-based accounting software, such as MyOb AccountWrite, that's cloud-based, or Xero, you can actually import your finance codes and select which finance codes you would like to import from Xero or from MyOb. If you don't have that, you can easily create finance codes here. When you first come into the system and you have no finance codes, you get to this form. And so this form allows you to type one finance code in, and then every other instance you get your big table. So what I'm going to do is create a finance code that might already exist in my system, but I'm just going to add one in that says accredited training, and I'll do 4-4001, for example. You can see that I've got a few more details here as well, such as having subcodes or till codes or cost center codes, and every integration is completely different, or every way that we export it, every client would use these areas differently.
For example, if you have something like a Xero integration and you actually have Xero married up with aXcelerate in terms of being fully integrated, your tracking categories, if you utilize those in Xero, will actually pull in here and you'll actually see them as two little drop downs. So this will kind of, and quite a few areas within our finance area, depending on, I guess, what integration you have, will kind of bend and form, I guess, as it needs to, yeah, given the requirements of each of the finance systems that we might be dealing with.
And much later in our, I think it's in the 12th week of the Cat and Katie show, we will be looking at Xero integration and MyOb integration. So we will recap finance codes in those areas when there's particular or important information to do with the Xero exports, such as what Katie just suggested. And when we get to the Xero area, we will look at tracking categories as well and come back into our finance codes. Likewise, we do also have agent commissions, and we can see that we've got a finance code here where it indicates that it tracks commissions so that you can track, I guess, the commissions against that finance code. What we do have down here is a long list of when we're saying what is the default, or is this finance code a default for a particular training or a particular event in aXcelerate. For example, down the bottom we can see we've got government funded training. So any contract reconciliation we're doing requires a default against government funded training. We can see that against my qualification fees, I already have a finance code of 4-4001. So I'm not going to be able to save this because it exists. So I might just put my initials in the end. And so you're specifying that when you have a qualification fee, this finance code is already set by default. So you don't have to enter or select from a drop-down list every single time you go into a student's enrollment fee page. So I'm just going to scroll down and press submit. And then we see that we're going to get a long list of different finance codes. Like all of our tables in aXcelerate, these are easily searchable. You can also filter the columns alphabetically or numerically. So finance codes are very straightforward. We will see how they interact with different finance details later on when we're raising invoices, such as how do they appear on a line item or how do we specify them in our item list. So this is purely just looking at how to add a finance code.
Mm-hmm. And just as Kat mentioned, just as a little sort of side, I guess just something on the side of what you've already talked about. With your finance codes, Kat was obviously talking about defaults and setting, you know, if you do have one primary finance code like 4-100 or 7532 or something like that, which is purely responsible for accredited training or maybe government funded training or whatever it might be, you know, by all means set a default there. But we do come up against or across a lot of RTOs that may actually even have one finance code per different type of course that they offer, or even a finance code or a GL code, you know, for a cluster of courses or a training category. You know, so you basically, what I'm trying to get at here is that you can go down to the course level to actually set those, and even to the student level. But yeah, we will be going over that in future sessions.
Okay, so the next thing that we're looking at is item lists. And I'm just going to quickly search here to show you that I've got a finance code here called extra items, and I'm going to create a list of items in my item list and link them to this finance code. And the reason why I'm linking them is that whenever I add an extra item to an invoice, whether it's an existing enrollment invoice or I'm creating a manual invoice, then the whole row is populated for me and my finance code is automatically added to my invoice because I've set it against the item list. So item lists are anything in addition to a course fee. So we can see here that I've got lots of different textbooks. I have late payment fees or reprint of certificates. For anyone from Western Australia, I have a resource fee in here as well. So basically an item list is anything that you're charging on top of the course fee. The item list is just as easy to add as the finance code. I'm going to put an additional item list in here. Maybe I'll call it student ID. So they have to pay for their student ID, and I'll just call that SD. And here is where I select my finance code. I'm then going to put in my default price of maybe it costs $10, which is inclusive of GST. And for me to post this out, I'm going to put a per item rate of $5. $5 of postage for every ID I send out. And I'll just simply submit that one. And then we can see it in my list here. Now I know I'm jumping ahead a bit, but I'm just going to quickly demonstrate how, if I jump into my profile here, if I was to quickly raise an invoice for myself, so this is what we refer to as a manual invoice. I'm just going to create a new invoice for myself, and over here I'm going to look for student ID, which pulls up my item lists, and we can see that it pulls in my finance code here for me, pulls in my unit price as well. So we were speaking about things quite, we're discussing how everything should work, and it's sometimes useful to see, well, how does that finance code that's assigned to student ID actually work in a invoice? I'm not going to continue on with our invoicing because we will look at that at a different stage. But basically, once again, our item list is something that you can add to a student's enrollment, or you can add to an existing invoice, or you can create a brand new invoice that's, for example, a student's coming in and they want to get a new certificate and you're charging them for this reprint of certificate. So it's like a standalone invoice that doesn't relate to any other course or any non-accredited training. Okay, so we're quickly wrapping up to the end of our 30 minutes here. Now, our next thing that we're focusing on is our finance models. Our finance models are traditionally used for government funding to easily specify how much is a student or what is the client tuition fee if the student's paying per hour or per unit of competency. But you can also use finance models if you have specific packages, I guess, that you have a concession rate or a non-concession rate, or you have a student that has specific textbooks they need to purchase. So a finance model just allows you to quickly assign a value and assign item lists to an enrollment. And the finance models are segregated by qualification. So I'm just going to choose my certificate 1 in business here, and I'm going to call this one new student enrollment. I'm going to specify it for my Queensland students because I have slightly different rates for other states, or maybe I'm based in Queensland. And I'm just going to set it for my actual students. What we can see here though is that I have employer or other. So you can also use this to specify if a student's employer is paying, such as a traineeship or an apprenticeship, or if a third party is paying, such as a mother or a father, for example. So for this example, I'm going to say that the student is paying $500 per qualification, and their employer is also paying, or they're paying $1,500 per qualification. So I'm going to split those two costs up, which will be used for a lot of clients that don't have government funding, is they'll use finance models to split a cost of a course. And the reason why we would split the cost of a course is so you can quickly raise an invoice for the appropriate person. That invoice is set to the correct bill to person. In the additional items here, I'm going to start to add in a student ID. The student has to pay for the student ID. The student also has to pay for the admin fee. And they have to pay for the workbook. Okay, so their employer funds a lot of their training, but the student has to pay for a lot of the resources. And I'll just submit that there. We will discuss finance models again in the future, especially when we're focusing on state funding, and we'll look at how you can use a finance model for Queensland state funding or how you can use a finance model for WA state funding. But for this example, we're looking at using a finance model for just our new students so we can quickly raise invoices. So what I'm going to do is jump ahead here and go into a class. I'm going into a Queensland class here. And I need to go into a class that has the same qualification. As we saw, finance models are, I guess, split up. Yeah, or they're based on qualifications. So I'm going to go into a class here. And if I scroll right down to the bottom, there's already invoices there. So let me enroll someone brand new. I'm going to enroll Katie. I'm going to enroll Jade.
I'm not even in this account.
Okay, if I scroll down to the bottom and I enroll contact, what I can do here is I can see my finance model, and I only see the finance models that are linked to this unit of competency, or sorry, linked to this qualification, which we cannot see mine here. So let me do that again. If I go into my finance model, it was the old course, not the new one. So I'll just go into, where's this one here? And when I go into enroll contact, there's my finance model of new student. And so we can see straight away that it's split up the $500 with all the items, and then it's split the $1,500 here. If I had an organization set against Michael, and we will be looking at this with our organizations, and let's just jump ahead here. I can see that he's got VM Learning, but there's no employer. So let's jump in and put Ray in there. And if I just go back and search for Michael and do that process all again, I just want to find, I'll go into, sorry, that one there. And go into my assessment example. And down the bottom here, if I just do that one more time, what we can see now is the employer contact here is Ray. So that's already been specified for me. I can jump down and go new student enrollment. All of my details set against my finance models is there. And then I can simply go set up the employee invoice now after I've selected the finance code. And straight away, I get brought to this page here, which I'm not going to look into this now because we're not looking at invoicing, but you can see that the benefits of using a finance model is I can quickly raise an invoice where it's invoiced to the employer, and the tuition fee is being set by the finance model. Likewise, the student details, if I just select that again, the student details or student fees are set by what was in the finance model, which I can override and change that to maybe on this instance, he's paying $750.
No discounts for Michael. So if we scroll down, I'm just jumping in here again, and we just want to go back and view the enrollment summary if we're not ready to raise invoices yet, and we just want to check that everything looks okay. We can jump straight down to finance details using this little button here. And we can see very clearly that there's a finance model that's been used, new student enrollment. We've got our tuition fee, which has been calculated for, well, not calculated in this occasion, but would be if it was a dollar amount per unit or per hour, with our additional items that are going to all be raised at the same time as the tuition fees. And then down the bottom here, our employer, Ray Mackay, who is to be invoiced $1,500. So I think that's pretty much all that we want to cover off, Kat. Is that right?
Yes, that's everything we've covered off. And remember that finance we've divided amongst many webinars, just because it's such a large area of the system. But this was more looking at how do we set up your system so that you are ready to start to raise invoices. If I just pull up the Kat and Katie show, which I'm not sure where it is, I'll just jump into here and pull up here. we can see that we've got the webinars here. So this week we're looking at contact management, finance, qualifications, and vet misconsiderations. But our next finance section will be coming in when we talk about discounts and payment plans in 2 weeks' time. So you'll have a lot of information there. Again, as I said, discounts and payment plans will be done before you start raising invoices. And it's part of your setup, but because they are so big, we've decided to have a separate webinar for each one of them.
And give you a break in between as well, because finance can be fun at the best of times, right, Kat?
Yes.
So Wendy just had a question. Sorry, I might just read that out. Will the new webinars be released at the start of each week? As in the recordings or the... I'm going to go off the fact that it might
To
be
enroll.
Okay.
Yeah. We're currently putting all of these in at the moment. So by the end of this week, you'll have the entire 12 weeks available for you to enroll into.
It's just all happened very quickly. So we've been trying to create madly as many workshop instances as we can. But you will, at the end of this week, close of business Friday, be able to then go in and book into the next 12 weeks, which we'd love you to do. We'd love to see you at all the other webinars as well.
And just as a little bit of, I guess, what we're looking at doing, and only you guys know this, is that underneath the help guide, you will have the Kat and Katie show. So rather than having a flash up every single time and having to use the guides to look for that link, you will have it up here where you can quickly just go in to enroll. And that will be in our next release.
And also then be able to quickly jump into all the recordings of all of the Kat and Katie show as well, so that you can go and listen to us to your heart's content, basically. Does anyone else have any other questions who is currently on the webinar? Awesome. Thanks, Pauline.
All right, everyone. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll chat to you next time.
Thanks, guys.
Kat and Katie Show.
Powered by aXcelerate.